My life was measured in rhythms. The screech of the alarm at 4:30 a.m., the bitter taste of black coffee, the rumble of my truck's engine coughing to life in the pre-dawn chill. It was a life of quiet repetition, a fortress built of routine to keep the silence from getting too loud. For years, this was enough. Work hard, go home, sleep. Repeat. I was a ghost on the job site, a competent pair of hands attached to a body that rarely spoke unless spoken to. I did my work, did it well, and faded into the background noise of saws and hammers. It was safer that way, less complicated. Then there was Cole. Cole was the foreman, a rhythm all his own. He moved with a kind of grounded certainty that I envied, a quiet authority that needed no shouting. His presence was a low hum on the site, a constant that everyone else orbited. I'd spent more time than I would ever admit watching him. It was a secret, shameful hobby. I'd watch the muscles in his back shift under his worn flannel shirt as he hoisted a beam. I'd listen to the low, steady cadence of his voice as he gave orders, a voice that sounded like gravel and honey. I knew the way he'd push his hair back from his forehead with the heel of his hand when he was frustrated, and the way a small smile would touch the corner of his mouth when a frame went up perfectly square. He was, in a word, everything I was not. Confident, decisive, seen. He was also, by all accounts, straight. He talked about football, fishing trips, and the endless parade of vaguely defined female friends who apparently populated his weekends. Listening to the casual way he existed in the world was a special kind of torture. It reinforced the chasm between us, the one I lived in and the one he commanded. He was the sun, and I was just a satellite, caught in his orbit, observing from a cold and distant dark. My crush was a fossil, buried deep under layers of self-preservation and practicality. It was a thing to be ignored, a dull ache I had learned to live with. The end of the week always brought a mandatory wind down. Big Mike, the owner of the company, would order a mountain of pizzas and a few dozen cases of cheap beer, and we'd all gather in the half-finished shell of whatever house we were building. It was a ritual of forced camaraderie, a loud, boisterous affair that always left my social battery drained and my ears ringing. I usually found a corner, nursed a single beer for an hour, and made my escape as soon as it was socially acceptable. This Friday was different. We'd just finished framing the second story of the Miller House, a big, ostentatious McMansion on the edge of town. It had been a brutal week of summer heat and heavy lifting, and the mood was even more celebratory than usual. The space was crowded, a chaotic mess of sawhorses, tool belts, and tired men letting off steam. Every available surface, upturned buckets, stacks of drywall, coolers, was occupied. I did a slow scan of the room, my usual anxiety prickling at the back of my neck. There was nowhere to retreat. And then I saw it. One lone, folding camp chair, miraculously empty, near the makeshift bar set up on a plywood sheet. A haven. I started moving towards it, a small surge of relief washing over me. Before I could take more than 2 steps, a large hand landed on my shoulder, stopping me in my tracks. The touch was firm, warm, and sent a completely unnecessary jolt straight down my spine. I knew who it was before I even turned. The scent of sawdust, sweat, and something else, something clean and sharp like cedar, was unmistakably Cole. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble right next to my ear. I could feel the vibrations of it in my chest. I turned slowly, trying to school my features into something neutral. He was closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He wasn't smiling, just looking at me with that steady, unreadable gaze of his. "Cole," I managed, my voice sounding thin. His eyes flicked over my shoulder towards the chair, then back to my face. A beat of silence passed between us, thick and heavy in the loud room. I thought he was going to claim the chair, and I was already preparing to nod and melt back into the shadows. It was his right, after all. He was the foreman. But he didn't move towards it. Instead, he walked past me, grabbed the chair, and set it down with a definitive thud in a slightly more open space. He sat, his long legs stretching out in front of him. He looked massive in the small chair, a study in solid lines and angles. He took a long drink from his beer, his throat working. My eyes tracked the movement, and I had to force myself to look away. He finished the swallow, and then looked right at me again, his gaze pinning me to the spot. The corner of his mouth ticked up, not quite a smile, but something close. The noise of the room seemed to fade into a dull roar. It was just him, the chair, and me, standing there like an idiot. Then he did something that completely short-circuited my brain. He patted his thigh. Not once, but twice. A firm, deliberate motion. His eyes never left mine. He said 5 words, his voice low but carrying easily over the din. There's only one. Take it. My mind went blank. Every coherent thought I possessed evaporated, leaving behind a buzzing, static panic. He couldn't possibly mean what I thought he meant. It had to be a joke. A weird, incomprehensible Foreman-to-worker joke that I was not equipped to understand. I looked around, expecting to see some of the other guys laughing, but no one was paying us any attention. They were all locked in their own loud conversations. This was a moment suspended in time, existing only between the two of us. I must have stood there frozen for a full 10 seconds, my mouth slightly agape. Cole's expression didn't change, but his eyes held a hint of a challenge. He wasn't looking away. He wasn't laughing. He just waited. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. My options were to turn and walk away, an act that would feel like a profound and humiliating rejection of something. I wasn't sure what. Or, I could do the unthinkable. I could do what he said. My body moved before my brain could veto the decision. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. It felt like walking through water. I was hyper-aware of everything. The crunch of sawdust under my boots, the way the bare bulb overhead cast a harsh glow on his face, the heat rolling off his body. I stopped in front of him. He didn't move. He just watched me, his gaze intense. I felt my cheeks flush with heat. Slowly, awkwardly, I lowered myself down. The world tilted as I settled onto his lap, perched sideways so I wasn't fully straddling him, my hip pressed against his stomach. The reality of it was immediate and overwhelming. He was so solid, so warm. His thigh was like a rock beneath me, a band of pure muscle. One of his hands came to rest on my lower back, a casual, grounding weight that felt anything but. His fingers were warm even through the fabric of my t-shirt and flannel. Every nerve ending in my body lit up at once. I could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. I was terrified to move, to even breathe too deeply, convinced that any sudden motion would shatter this fragile, impossible moment. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that traveled from his chest, through his thigh, and directly into me. I couldn't find my voice. I just managed a jerky nod, my eyes fixed on a knot in the plywood floor across the room. I could feel the stares of the other guys now, or at least, I imagined I could. My entire body was tense, coiled like a spring. This had to be the strangest moment of my entire life. Sitting on my straight foreman's lap in a room full of construction workers. The absurdity of it was staggering. Cole didn't seem to notice my internal crisis. He just took another sip of his beer, his arm brushing against my side. His hand on my back didn't move. It stayed there, a point of searing heat, claiming the space. He leaned back slightly, getting more comfortable in the chair, which had the effect of pulling me more securely against him. My back was now flush against his chest. I could feel the steady, thudding beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. It was slow and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic hummingbird trapped in my own chest. He fell into a conversation with another guy, talking about lumber prices and delivery schedules. He spoke as if nothing unusual was happening, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for me to be sitting on his lap. And maybe for him, it was. Maybe this was just a practical, space-saving solution, devoid of any of the monumental, earth-shattering meaning I was assigning to it. The thought was both a relief and a profound disappointment. But then his thumb began to move. Just a small, almost imperceptible motion. He started rubbing slow, lazy circles on my lower back, right over the hem of my shirt where it tucked into my jeans. It was a hypnotic, absent-minded gesture. A touch that could mean nothing. A touch that could mean everything. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to focus on the conversation, on the noise, on anything other than the feeling of that thumb stroking my back and the solid wall of his chest behind me. But it was impossible. My entire universe had shrunk to the points of contact between our bodies. The world outside this small, charged bubble ceased to exist. I was acutely aware of the hard lines of his body, The faint scent of his cologne mingling with sawdust, the sheer, undeniable fact of his presence engulfing me. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just sat there, a silent passenger on the strange island of Cole's lap, while the party raged on around us. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside my own head was completely, utterly gone. It had been replaced by a deafening, terrifying, and hopeful roar. The days that followed were a masterclass in exquisite torture. My mind replayed the chair incident on a continuous loop, analyzing every second, every micro-expression, every possible interpretation. I was a detective investigating a crime with only one piece of baffling evidence. The logical part of my brain insisted it was a fluke, a weird, meaningless event born from a lack of seating and Cole's particular brand of no-nonsense pragmatism. He needed a place to sit. I needed a place to sit. It was simple physics. Problem solved. But the other part of me, the hopeful, foolish part that I had kept locked away for years, refused to be silent. It clung to the memory of his hand on my back, the slow circles his thumb had drawn. It fixated on the utter lack of self-consciousness in his actions. He hadn't been joking or trying to embarrass me. He had been matter-of-fact, as if my presence on his lap was an unremarkable occurrence. This thought was far more dangerous than the idea of it being a prank. A prank I could dismiss. This quiet acceptance was something I didn't know what to do with. Work became a minefield of heightened awareness. My observation of him, once a passive, distant hobby, was now an active, desperate search for clues. I watched him constantly, my gaze drawn to him like a compass needle to true north. I saw things I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps things I hadn't allowed myself to see. I saw the way his eyes would find me across the job site, holding my gaze for a fraction of a second too long before flicking away. It happened once while I was on a ladder, securing a joist. I looked down and he was standing at the base, looking up, his expression unreadable. Our eyes met, and the world seemed to stop for a beat. He gave me a curt nod, then turned and walked away, but the intensity of that brief connection left me shaky. Another time, we were working in a tight hallway, passing materials back and forth. As he squeezed past me, his hand came up and rested on the small of my back, guiding me out of the way. It was a common, practical gesture on a crowded site, but his hand lingered. It was only for a second, maybe two, but the pressure was deliberate, the warmth seeping through my shirt. My breath hitched. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I just stood there after he'd passed, feeling the ghost of his touch on my skin, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every interaction became freighted with meaning. When he handed me a tool, I was hyper-aware of his calloused fingers brushing against mine. When he spoke to me, I focused on the low timbre of his voice, trying to decipher any hidden warmth or meaning in his tone. I was driving myself mad, caught in a cycle of hope and doubt. One moment, I'd be convinced I was imagining everything, that I was projecting my own pathetic yearning onto a man who was simply being a decent boss. The next, he'd do something, a lingering look, a casual touch, that would send my hopes soaring all over again. The other guys on the crew noticed nothing. To them, Cole was the same as he always was, a fair, no-nonsense foreman. And I was the same quiet Leo, the guy who kept to himself. The strange intimacy of that Friday night remained our secret, an invisible thread connecting us that only I seemed to feel tugging. About a week after the chair incident, Big Mike pulled me and Cole aside. "Got a side job for you too," he said, chewing on an unlit cigar. "The old Henderson cabin up by the lake. Porch is rotting out, needs to be replaced. Should only take you a couple days. I need my main crew here to finish the push on the Miller house." My stomach did a nervous flip. A couple of days. Alone with Cole. Away from the noise and chaos of the main site. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. Cole just nodded, his face impassive. "No problem, Mike. We'll load up the truck and head out tomorrow morning." He glanced at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic mask. The drive up to the lake the next morning was quiet. The cab of his truck was a small, intimate space, filled with the scent of coffee and that faint, woodsy smell that clung to him. The radio played low, some classic rock station. I stared out the passenger window, watching the trees blur into a green smear, my mind racing. What would it be like? Just the two of us, with no audience, no buffer. Would the fragile, unspoken tension between us snap, or would it simply dissipate into the mountain air? Cole seemed perfectly relaxed. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, mere inches from my own. I was acutely aware of the proximity, of the warmth radiating from him. I kept my hands clenched in my lap, my knuckles white. "You ever been up to this lake before?" he asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "No," I said, my own voice sounding rusty. "Never." "It's quiet," he said. "Good place to clear your head." He glanced at me. "You seem like a guy who's got a lot going on in his head." The observation was so direct, so perceptive, it caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. "I guess," I mumbled, turning to look back out the window, my cheeks growing warm. He didn't press. He just turned his attention back to the winding road, and we lapsed back into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It felt less like an absence of words and more like a space filled with things unsaid. He saw me. He actually saw me, not just as a pair of hands, but as a person. The thought was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The Henderson cabin was exactly as you'd picture it, a small, rustic log structure nestled in a grove of pine trees, 100 yards from the shore of a placid, gray lake. It was isolated, peaceful, and the air was crisp and clean. The porch was in a sorry state, the wood soft and spongy with rot. We got to work immediately, the familiar rhythm of labor a welcome distraction. We fell into an easy, efficient partnership. I would measure and mark the boards, and he would make the cuts with the circular saw. His movements were economical and precise, a testament to years of experience. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. I found myself watching his hands as he worked, the way they expertly guided the saw, strong and steady. We worked hard all morning. The only sounds the whine of the saw, the thud of the hammer, and the chirping of birds in the trees. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. There was a current of understanding that flowed between us, a professional synergy that was comfortable and easy. Around noon, he cut the power to the saw and wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "Lunch break," he announced. We sat on the tailgate of his truck, eating the sandwiches we'd packed. The silence returned, but again, it felt different out here. It was peaceful, not awkward. The forest seemed to absorb it. I was starting to relax, the constant tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in days. "So," Cole said, after swallowing a large bite of his sandwich. "What's your story, Leo?" I looked at him, surprised. "My story?" "Yeah," he said, looking out at the lake. "You've been on my crew for what, 3 years? I know you're a damn good carpenter. I know you're always on time. And I know you're quiet as a church mouse. That's about it." He turned his head and met my eyes. His gaze was direct, curious. "There's got to be more to you than that." My heart started to pound again. This was the moment of softness, the crack in the stoic facade I'd only ever seen from a distance. He was asking about me. He wanted to know me. I fumbled for an answer, my mind a sudden blank. What was my story? It felt so small, so uninteresting. "Not much to tell," I said, shrugging. "Grew up here. Went to trade school. Started working. That's about it." It was a pathetic, skeletal summary of a life, and I felt a flush of shame. He just watched me, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "I don't believe that," he said softly. "Nobody's story is that simple." I looked down at my hands, at the sandwich I was no longer hungry for. I felt exposed, seen in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had spent so long building my walls, and here he was, not even trying to knock them down, but simply pointing out that he could see right through them. "What about you?" I deflected, my voice barely a whisper. "What's your story?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he looked at the water. I thought maybe I had overstepped, that he would shut down. But then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Grew up on a ranch in Montana," he said. "Hard life. Learned to work before I learned to read, pretty much. My old man was tough." He paused, and in that pause, I heard a whole world of unspoken history. "Came here after he passed. Needed a change of scenery. Found this work. It's honest. You build something with your hands. You can see what you've accomplished at the end of the day. It's simple. I like simple." He turned to look at me again, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes I had never seen before. A flicker of some old sadness, some deep weariness. In that moment, he wasn't just Cole, the confident foreman. He was just a man with a past, with his own set of walls. And for some reason, he had just shown me a small crack in his. I get that, I said, and the words were true. I understood the appeal of simple, tangible work. The way it could fill your days and tire your body, leaving no room for the complicated, messy thoughts. We sat in silence for a while longer, the shared confession hanging in the air between us. It was a fragile, precious thing. A bridge had been built between us, not with wood and nails, but with a few quiet, honest words. The tension I'd been feeling all week hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer just a product of my own one-sided obsession. Now it felt shared. It felt real. And that was infinitely more terrifying. The second day at the cabin started with a fine, misty rain that slicked the new deck boards and hung in the air like a veil. The work was slower, more deliberate. We had to be careful not to slip on the wet wood. The enforced caution created a strange intimacy. We were constantly brushing against each other in the confined space of the porch, our hands touching as we passed screws, our shoulders bumping as we maneuvered long planks into place. Each touch was a small spark in the damp air, a silent acknowledgement of the space we shared. By mid-afternoon, the rain had intensified, shifting from a persistent mist to a steady, relentless downpour. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and a rumble of distant thunder echoed across the lake. "That's it," Cole said, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. "We're not getting anything else done in this. Let's pack it in for the day." We quickly covered the tools and materials with a tarp, the rain plastering our hair to our foreheads and soaking through our jeans. We retreated to the cab of his truck, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof a sudden, deafening roar. Cole started the engine and cranked the heat, and a blast of warm air filled the small space, carrying with it the damp, earthy smell of our clothes. He put the truck in gear, but didn't move. He just sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the rain-swept lake. "No sense in driving back in this," he said, his voice low. "Roads will be a mess. We can wait it out." My heart lurched. Trapped. We were trapped in this small, warm space together, the outside world erased by the sheets of rain. The tension that had been simmering between us all day cranked up to a boiling point. I could feel it in the air, a palpable, electric charge. I stared at my own hands, unable to look at him, my breathing shallow. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers and the drumming rain. The windows began to fog up, enclosing us further, creating our own private, misty world. I could feel his presence beside me like a physical weight, his warmth seeping into the space between us. I risked a glance at him. He was looking at me. His expression was serious, his eyes dark and intense. The casual friendliness from our lunch break the day before was gone, replaced by something raw and searching. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the noise of the storm. "What's going on?" My throat went dry. "What do you mean?" I asked, the words barely a whisper. "Don't play dumb," he said, his voice still low, but with an edge of impatience. "This thing, between us, ever since that night at the Miller house. Your wound's so tight you're about to snap. You can't even look at me." He was right. I was a walking bundle of exposed nerves. My carefully constructed walls were crumbling, and the panic was so intense I felt dizzy. I had no idea what to say, what he wanted me to say. Deny it? Laugh it off. The words wouldn't come. I just shook my head, a small, helpless gesture. "I don't know," I breathed. He let out a frustrated sigh and turned in his seat to face me more directly. He reached out and put his hand on my knee. The touch was electric. It wasn't casual or accidental. It was deliberate, a claim. "Talk to me, Leo," he said, his voice softening slightly. I'm not good at this. At guessing games." I looked at his hand on my knee. His fingers were long and calloused, the knuckles scarred. A working man's hand. It was holding me in place, demanding an answer. I lifted my eyes to his, and what I saw there stole my breath. It wasn't anger or confusion. It was a reflection of my own desperate uncertainty, my own suffocating hope. He was just as lost in this as I was. And in that moment, something inside me broke. The fear, the years of hiding, the crushing loneliness, it all gave way to a single, overwhelming need to be honest, just once. I can't stop thinking about it, I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. About you. About that night. I. I see the way you look at me sometimes. And I don't know if I'm crazy, if I'm just making it all up in my head because my voice broke. I couldn't say the rest. I couldn't admit how much I wanted it to be real. Cole's expression softened completely. The hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. His thumb began to stroke my knee, a soothing, hypnotic motion. You're not crazy, he said, his voice a low caress. You're not making it up. The world stopped. The rain, the wipers, the hum of the engine, it all faded away. The only thing that existed was his voice, his touch, and the impossible truth in his eyes. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I was frozen, mesmerized. My entire life, I had been a spectator, watching from the sidelines. But now, the game had come to me, and I couldn't bring myself to run. His other hand came up to my face, his rough palm cupping my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, and I leaned into the touch, my eyes fluttering shut. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a fantasy I'd played out in my head 1,000 times. And then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, hesitant, questioning. It was the taste of rain and coffee, the feeling of rough stubble against my skin. It was a question, and I answered by pressing back, my own hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was hammering just as fast as mine. The kiss deepened, the initial hesitancy giving way to a raw, desperate hunger that had been simmering between us for weeks, maybe years. It was a release of all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up tension. It was messy and desperate and overwhelmingly real. His hand slid from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my damp hair, pulling me closer. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We just stared at each other, our foreheads resting together, the windows of the truck completely fogged over, sealing us in our own private universe. Leo, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't speak. I could only look at him, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. The stoic, unreadable Foreman was gone. In his place was just Cole, a man whose eyes were filled with the same wonder and terror that I felt. He kissed me again, a short, gentle press of his lips against mine. It was a promise, a confirmation. It was real. The drive back to town was a surreal dream. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the world outside the truck's windows seemed brand new, washed clean and vibrant. We didn't talk. There were no words for what had just happened, for the monumental shift that had occurred in the small, fogged-up cab of his truck. A comfortable, charged silence settled between us, thick with the aftermath of that kiss. Cole's hand rested on the center console, and after a few miles, my own hand dared to move, my fingers brushing against his. He immediately captured my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, his grip firm and reassuring. He held my hand for the rest of the drive, his thumb rubbing slow circles over my knuckles. It was a simple, profound gesture of connection that said more than any words could. He pulled up in front of my small, rented house. The engine idled, the sound a low hum in the twilight. The moment I had been dreading arrived. The end of the bubble. The return to reality. My mind flooded with 1,000 anxious questions. What now? What happens on Monday, back on the site, in front of everyone? Was this a one-time thing, a strange aberration brought on by a rainstorm and forced proximity? The fear of it being a mistake, his mistake, was a cold knot in my stomach. I reluctantly pulled my hand from his, the loss of contact an immediate ache. Well, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally high. Thanks for the ride. Cole didn't answer. He just looked at me, his expression serious. Leo, he said, his voice low and steady. Look at me. I forced myself to meet his gaze. That wasn't just the rain, he said, as if reading my mind. Okay. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I'll see you Monday, he said. It sounded like a question. Yeah, I whispered. Monday. I got out of the truck and walked to my front door, fumbling with my keys. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of what I might see, or what I might not see, in his face. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and leaned against it, listening. I heard the truck sit there for a long moment, and then, finally, the sound of it pulling away. The silence of my empty house was deafening. The weekend stretched before me, a vast, empty space for my anxiety to fill. I spent most of Saturday replaying the kiss, replaying every word he'd said, searching for loopholes, for signs of regret. My mind was my own worst enemy, whispering doubts. He's straight. He was just confused. He'll come to his senses over the weekend, and on Monday, it'll be like it never happened. He'll be cold, distant, and I'll have to live with the humiliation of having misread everything. By Sunday night, I had worked myself into a state of quiet panic. I barely slept, my stomach churning. The thought of facing him, of facing the entire crew, was terrifying. The fortress of my routine, once a comfort, now felt like a prison I had to return to. Monday morning was gray and cold. I felt sick as I pulled into the work site. The usual boisterous energy was there, guys yelling greetings, the smell of coffee and exhaust hanging in the air. I kept my head down, making a beeline for the tool shed. I just wanted to grab my belt and disappear into the work. I didn't see Cole at first. My relief was so profound it almost made me weak at the knees. Maybe he'd called in sick. Maybe he'd quit. Maybe he'd left the state. My imagination ran wild with possibilities, each one more ridiculous than the last. I was checking a level when a shadow fell over me. "Morning, Leo." His voice, low, calm, and directly behind me. My entire body went rigid. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, bracing myself for the cold shoulder, for the awkward apology, for the "we need to forget this happened" speech. I turned around slowly. He was standing there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, his face set in its usual stoic lines. But his eyes were different. They were soft, and they were fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. He held out one of the cups to me. "Figured you might need this," he said. I took it, my fingers brushing his. The warmth of the cup seeped into my cold hands. "Thanks," I mumbled, staring into the black liquid. The other guys were milling around, but no one was paying us any attention. We were in our own little world again, just like in the truck. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I looked up at him. I tried to form a lie, to say I was fine, but the anxiety must have been written all over my face. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile of reassurance. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're okay." And just like that, the knot in my stomach loosened. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a soul-bearing confession. It was just 4 quiet words and a cup of coffee. But it was enough. It was everything. It was him, in the bright light of Monday morning, in front of God and everyone, telling me that what happened between us was real and it wasn't going away. The rest of the day was normal, and that was the most shocking thing of all. We worked. Cole was the foreman, and I was one of his crew. He gave me orders, and I followed them. But underneath the surface of that normality, everything had changed. There was a new current between us, a silent conversation happening in the spaces between words, a lingering glance when he thought no one was looking, a moment when we were working side by side where his arm would press against mine for just a second longer than necessary. The real test came at lunch. We were all sitting around, eating, when one of the other guys, a loudmouth named Ricky, started telling a crude, homophobic joke. My stomach clenched. I instinctively braced myself, my eyes dropping to the ground. This was the world I lived in, the one I had hidden from. I felt a hot flush of shame, both for myself and for the fact that Cole had to hear this. I didn't dare look at him. I just waited for the punchline, for the inevitable round of loud, ugly laughter. But it never came. There was a sudden, heavy silence. I risked a glance up. Ricky had trailed off mid-sentence, his stupid grin faltering. He was looking at Cole. Everyone was looking at Cole. He hadn't said a word. He was just staring at Ricky, his expression completely blank. He slowly, deliberately, put down his sandwich. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Cole's gaze was like ice. It was the coldest, hardest look I had ever seen on his face. He didn't need to say anything. The message was perfectly clear. Ricky's face turned red. He stammered something, an apology or an excuse, I couldn't tell. "Just eat your lunch, Ricky," Cole said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. It was more chilling than if he had yelled. Ricky mumbled a yes, boss, and immediately busied himself with his food. The conversation around the circle slowly, awkwardly, started up again, but the tone had shifted. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense caution. Cole never looked at me. Not once during the entire exchange. But he didn't have to. He had done it for me. He had stood up for me, for us, in the most public way he could, without saying a single word about it. He had drawn a line in the sand. And in that moment, my fear was replaced by a wave of something fierce and protective and deeply grateful. I wasn't alone in this. That evening, as I was packing my tools into my truck, he appeared at my side. "Got plans tonight?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I shook my head, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "No, nothing." "Good," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He pressed it into my hand. "My address. Come over for dinner. 7 o'clock. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An invitation into his life. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He gave me a small, genuine smile, the first one I'd seen all day. "Okay," he repeated. Then he turned and walked to his own truck, leaving me standing there with a piece of paper in my hand that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It was a map to a new world I was terrified and desperate to explore. Pulling up to Cole's house that night felt like crossing a threshold into another dimension. His place was small, simple, and immaculately kept, a craftsman-style house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It suited him. It was solid, unpretentious, and grounded. I sat in my truck for a full 5 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my courage failing me. This was real. This wasn't a secret kiss in a rainstorm or a shared understanding on a job site. This was a date. A real date. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I finally forced myself out of the truck and walked up the stone path to his front door. Before my knuckles could even touch the wood, the door swung open. He was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, a small smile on his face. He'd showered and changed into a clean t-shirt and jeans. He looked relaxed, comfortable. He looked like he was home. "You were just going to sit out there all night?" he asked, his voice laced with gentle amusement. My cheeks flushed. I was composing myself. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Get in here, Leo." He stepped aside, and I walked into his house. The inside smelled like lemon polish and something cooking, something savory and delicious. It was clean and masculine, decorated with dark woods and comfortable-looking furniture. There were framed photos on the mantelpiece, a rugged landscape that looked like Montana, an older couple who I assumed were his parents. It was a home, a life, and he had invited me into it. "Smells good," I said, needing to fill the silence. "Just steak and potatoes," he said, closing the door behind me. "Nothing fancy." He gestured towards the living room. "Make yourself comfortable. Beer's in the fridge if you want 1 inch." The domesticity of it was almost too much to handle. I felt awkward and out of place, like I was wearing shoes that were 2 sizes too big. I retrieved a beer from the fridge and perched on the edge of his comfortable-looking sofa, taking a long drink. Cole moved around the kitchen with an easy, familiar grace, checking on the food, his back to me. "So," he said, without turning around, "we gonna talk about it?" My stomach dropped. "Talk about what?" I asked, even though I knew perfectly well. He turned from the stove, a spatula in his hand. He leaned against the counter and looked at me, his expression serious. "Ricky, today at lunch." "Oh," I said. "That," I looked down into my beer. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," he said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "That kind of talk, it's not happening on my site." "Not anymore," he paused, his gaze unwavering. "And nobody talks that way around my—" He stopped, searching for the word. He let out a small, frustrated breath. "Around you," he finished, his voice soft. My heart did a painful, hopeful squeeze. He couldn't find the word because there wasn't one yet. We were a question mark, a fragile, new thing with no name. But the intent was there, clear and bright. He was claiming me, protecting me. "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, then turned back to the stove. The conversation was over, but everything had been said. He had once again, without fanfare or drama, made his position clear. I was his to protect. We ate dinner at his small kitchen table. The steak was perfect, the The potatoes were crispy, and the conversation was surprisingly easy. We talked about work, about music, about dumb movies we both liked. He asked me about my family, and I told him about my parents who had retired to Florida, about my sister in Oregon. I found myself talking more than I had in years, the words flowing out of me without the usual hesitation and anxiety. He was a good listener, his attention focused entirely on me, making me feel like what I had to say was important. After dinner, we moved to the living room. We sat on the couch, a respectable distance between us, a football game playing on the television with the sound turned low. The easy conversation from dinner had dried up, and the charged awareness of each other returned, filling the space between us. I was so conscious of his presence, of the heat from his body, of the way his arm was resting on the back of the couch, just behind my head. He cleared his throat. "Leo," he began, and I turned to look at him. He had turned off the television. The room was cast in the soft glow of a single lamp. "I'm not good at this," he said, echoing his words from the truck. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and uncertainty. "I've never done this before." "Done what?" I asked softly, though I knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing to the space between us. "With a guy." He looked me straight in the eye, his expression open and vulnerable. "All I know is that for the last few weeks, I haven't been able to get you out of my head. I see you on the site, so quiet and focused, and I don't know. I just wanted to know what was going on in there." He tapped his own temple. "Then that night, with the chair. It was a stupid, impulsive thing. But when you actually sat down," he shook his head, a small, incredulous smile on his face. "Everything just sort of clicked into place. I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to," I said, my voice thick. "I get it. I've been watching you for a long time." The confession slipped out, quiet and shameful, but I couldn't hold it back any longer. His smile widened. "I know," he said. "I noticed." Of course he had. He noticed everything. The thought should have been mortifying, but instead, it was a profound relief. He knew. He had known, and he hadn't run. He had moved closer. He shifted on the couch, closing the distance between us. He took my hand, his calloused palm warm and dry against mine. He studied our joined hands for a long moment. "I don't know what this is, or where it's going," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I just know that I don't want it to stop." He lifted his gaze to mine, his eyes dark and sincere. Is that okay with you?" All the fear, all the anxiety I had been carrying for weeks, for years, finally melted away, replaced by a quiet, steady certainty. This was real. This was happening. "Yeah," I breathed, a real smile spreading across my face for the first time. "That's okay with me." He leaned in and kissed me. It was nothing like the desperate, frantic kiss in the truck. This was slow and deep and sure. It was a kiss that held the promise of a beginning. It was gentle and unhurried, a quiet conversation between two people who had finally found a language they both understood. His other hand came up to cup my face, his thumb stroking my jawline. I melted into him, my body relaxing against his for the first time, all the tension draining out of me. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my lips. "Stay," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't a ghost, or a spectator, or an outsider. I was here, with him. "Okay," I whispered back. We didn't move for a long time. We just stayed there, foreheads pressed together, hands intertwined, breathing the same air in the quiet, lamplit room. There were a million things still to figure out, a whole world to navigate. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the solid, grounding presence of the man beside me, and the quiet, simple truth that I had, against all odds, come home. The fortress of my routine had been breached, not by a violent assault, but by a quiet, persistent presence who had simply found the gate and waited for me to let him in. And as I sat there, wrapped in the warmth and safety of his arms, I knew I would never lock it again.